I'm subscribed to the Hema YouTuber Shad. I find his content interesting, and his thoughts on the logical construction of fantasy universes are generally ones I agree with. I'm also getting back into reading fiction, and I find first novels to be something I especially want to check out. With that in mind, I bought and read his first novel, Shadow of the Conqueror, Chronicles of Everfall. It's been out a long time now, so it's hardly like this review is fresh. Still, I gotta check it out and support his channel somewhat after years of always keeping that pesky adblock on. That said, I will not show any mercy just because I like the guy and his channel. So having read it, what is my overall rating? My overall rating is that it's a very flawed book that has promise in terms of its concept, but leaves execution being very much desired. I think that if I were to rate it on a point system, it would be slightly below average. Not terrible, but slightly bad, like 4 out of 10 if I were to commit to a 10-point rating system. It won't be enough to just say that, so I'll go into detail, of course. Expect general mild spoilers about aspects of the world or plot points that are evident right from the beginning, but I will give some advance warning of when I'm going to continuously be getting into major spoilers. First, the good. I think the world building is a real high point of the book. Shad has spent a lot of time thinking about how his strange world functions. We have this continent which is eternally floating in an infinite sky due to what is called darkstone, and if you fall down one side you hit this barrier and appear from the other side far above. Darkstone is fixed in place in direct sunlight, but if you shine a complementary mineral known as sunstone on it from a particular direction, you can induce movement, and this gives rise to all sorts of transport uses. In addition, if you directly touch a darkstone with sunstone, then it is possible to move a darkstone by hand. This is expanded in a hard magic system in which the uses of these stones remain consistent and follow a certain formula. Another cool aspect is that the carrying of swords is widespread. It's widespread for the reason that the continent is bathed in eternal daylight ordinarily, and every night is a disaster that only happens generationally. Evil entities known as the Shade are able to spread during these nights, and can only be defeated by being severed. This means that every citizen has to be ready for the night and the return of the Shade, giving a justification for the bearing of swords. This leads to dueling. The dueling system is cool enough and sensible enough to make me want it to exist in real life. It's possible to duel without doing so, but the compulsion to duel in terms of honour is only present if you wear a red ribbon and thus issue your intention to both issue and accept challenges. That means people can duel for honour, but you can also opt out by not wearing the ribbon, in view of my own particular morality, thereby fixing the one key problem of historical dueling. People wear clothes that facilitate dueling, especially women. Another interesting element is that because of the justification for sword wielding, the use of specialised stabbing swords such as rapiers and the use of sunstone darkstone powered guns known as shot spikes is frowned upon. Only cutting attacks are useful against the Shade after all. Interestingly, I think of all the sword duels that take place in the book, the one that occurs at the very beginning before superpowers start being involved is actually the best. And that's a duel between a stiff old man and a young upstart, in which skill is the deciding factor. Overall, Shad has definitely created a universe that would be really fascinating to visit, even if you wouldn't want to live there. The magic system is of the hard magic type. It's exactly the sort of thing he discusses in many of his speculation videos. To spoil a bit, so spoiler alert, there is a sequence at the beginning of the book which sets everything in motion. The main character, Dallas the Conqueror, full of regret over his past as a brutal dictator, has spent many years in hiding, and now finally, after leaving a letter for the world, he is planning to commit suicide by throwing himself from the continent. If you hold a piece of darkstone while passing through the barrier, supposedly only obliteration awaits. Dallas, for his part, wants to really make sure by holding both sunstone and darkstone, which to his knowledge has not been done before. However, in reality, this is the doorway to possessing incredible abilities, usually held only by a special group of warriors known as Archknights, who keep the origin of their powers a closely guarded secret. Surviving this process, he is reborn into youth with the powers of a Lightbinder, which involve the ability to convert sunlight into a magical power which he can use to enhance various facets of his skills, as well as properties such as his mass. This first sequence, where he's reborn but has to work out on the fly how to use his abilities to safely stop himself as he drifts back towards the surface of the continent, is very well thought out in terms of how an ability to conjure mass might work, since it deals with the question of whether or not that new mass would have the momentum of your previously existing mass or not. Interesting hijinks ensue from there, with at one point the character blowing up his feet after accidentally phasing into the ground. If you have light and are not exhausted, the ability suffices to heal you, of course. Normally, Lightbinders specialise in one type of ability, but Daedalus can pretty much do everything. Obviously, if you get too bogged down with exposition, a hard magic system can be a detriment, but the beauty of a hard magic system is that it presents puzzles that we solve along with the character. Mostly I think that the book falls into the second category early on, but starts to drift into the former category by the midway point. It starts getting a bit ridiculous when he is able to bond light with his skill with the sword itself, supercharging his combat ability in a way nobody has ever achieved before. There seems to overall be few intrinsic limitations on potential loopholes with light binding. Since we are now getting into negative territory, I'll continue in that vein. Although I praise the world building, there are too few gaps left for anything of weight to be anticipated. The lack of mystery comes from the fact that this is a fully explored, mapped out world in an Industrial Revolution type setting that just happens to have swordsmanship in it. This is not a quasi-medieval world in which there is a map and there are dragons off the edges. Certainly Shad doesn't play all his cards with regard to the shade, but I think what remains to be seen are simply more powerful types in bigger fight scenes. It's quite well established what the shade are and what will bring them forth already. They aren't mysterious eldritch entities from a nearly forgotten legend, they are simply what happens when a human being goes long enough without daylight in this world. The book is ambitious, which would be to its credit, in picking such a heavy subject as the reformation of a murderous rapist former dictator now reborn as his young self, passing himself off as his own hidden son, Dalen. He ends up with a none the wiser companion, Arak, who is a kind of mage of light known as a Lightbringer, a sort of support role for the Lightbinders, who does what he does due to a religious obligation to what is called the Light, effectively the deity of this world. Daedalus aims to do good as he sees fit while hiding his true nature from others. Unfortunately, I think the tone of the story falls short of fitting a topic area this heavy. It's definitely an undignified narrative. There's none of the grandeur or mystery inherent to a Lord of the Rings style fantasy, or even the rip-offs like the Shannara series. A lot of the dialogue comprises of extremely corny jokes, which kind of works when it's confined to the companion of Daedalus, Arak the Lightbinder, whose jokes are charmingly innocent, but not when every character has their own special brand of wisecracking. There's also a lot of very awkwardly handled and somewhat obsessive sexual content. Not sex scenes, mind you, of which none occur on page, but certainly most of the cultural differences covered in the book are to do with odd sex-adjacent practices, such as Kuseg's race, the Teresians, appearing entirely naked. In their culture, you have to test yourself by going around naked without anyone being aroused for some reason. Kuseg himself opts to simply go shirtless to acquiesce to the cultural practices of the knights. He appears as part of a duo with Lyra, his female superior, who is endlessly embarrassed by his antics. This is vaguely amusing, but it kind of fails to remain so when you learn that the reason Lyra is awkward around anything vaguely sexual is because she was raped. The main character Daedalus is still the largest sticking point by far. Daedalus is just as juvenile as an old man as he is when pretending to be a young one. He's an extremely unlikable character who believes that his redemption should occur entirely on his own terms. This may be intentional, but it does present a problem in that ultimately you are rooting for the other characters to uncover his deception. He has a kind of Gary Stew quality to him in that he seems to be skilled at everything. Now, you can have all-powerful characters, but this is usually offset by personal flaws. Shad offsets Daedalus by making him a former tyrant and a current impetuous youth once more, who lets his anger get the better of him easily. That's hard to balance because normally we have a character with some likeable qualities who is humanised with some flaws. However, Daedalus has no likeable qualities whatsoever. Again, this may be intentional, and whether it works for you is subjective, but it sure didn't work for me. The character feels so much guilt, so much remorse, but he seems to treat his reform as an adventure. The character even claims to hate killing and is only doing it to uphold good, but the way in which he kills his enemies goes beyond basically dispatching them and ends up in pure sadist territory, making his claims suspect indeed. It has this huge heavy shadow hanging over it, but scene to scene is written as if it's a swashbuckling adventure. This is a fundamental flaw of the novel that breaks it for me. The execution can't support the ambition, and that's a shame because if the execution was supporting a less weighty kind of story, it would work just fine. And if you then took the ambition and had a more experienced author execute it, the result would be a lot better. There are two separate novels here which are unfortunately entwined together. Big spoilers as we continue. The narrative ultimately resolves in Daedalus saving the capital city from a huge disaster, preventing a revolutionary plot, but henceforth being put on trial for his previous crimes as Daedalus the Conqueror. We end up with a trial scene in which several women who were raped by Daedalus have to bear witness. It all ultimately ends in his execution being stayed due to his actions in saving the city and him having to formally join the Archknights and remain under their supervision, under the particular supervision of Lyra, who was also raped by him when she was a little girl. How do you go forward with that? I'm all for covering dark territory, but this is dangerous territory for a new writer to tackle, as they may not have developed the skills necessary to pull off that narrative in a way that's convincing, and convincing this is not. I'm not saying that it's not interesting, but it's not convincing. Really, the redemption of the would-be protagonist and reveal of his true nature should have been paced across multiple books, because this is clearly the beginning of the series, and the character has done things so bad and irredeemable, we as readers need more time as well. Other characters like Arek, Lyra, and Kuseg are a lot more likeable, though again, big spoilers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, Kuseg gets killed off completely unceremoniously off-page in the closing chapters of the book. Ultimately, although I am overall negative, I do feel that it fails in an at least interesting way, and that there is promise in the basic concepts behind the story. That's entirely understandable for a new author, however, and if you can align the character writing, the tone and the scenarios to the otherwise well-done world crafting, then I'll be inclined to like other works from Shad a lot more. Of course, again, this is just my subjective take on the matter, because all of the things I've mentioned being flaws depend on the particular standards I have and expectations I have about fantasy novels. I've got to be honest about what I think about the book though, having bothered to read it. I'm not sure if I can recommend it at all, but in spite of the flaws, I do kind of want to know how the story of Daedalus is going to continue after such a conclusion has already been reached, so I'm fairly inclined to purchase a sequel. So 4 out of 10 in conventional terms, but somehow elevated a little by its frustrating promise. I can't say it's not interesting.